The first civilizations had survived. Cities had risen from the dust. Kings ruled growing populations. Empires stretched farther than anyone had once imagined. For a brief moment, it may have seemed that humanity had solved its greatest problem: survival. But history has a habit of creating new challenges. Because once a civilization becomes powerful enough to feed itself, it begins looking beyond its borders. And when powerful civilizations look beyond their borders, they usually see the same things: land, resources, trade, wealth, power. Soon, the great civilizations of the ancient world would discover a lesson every empire eventually learns. Building civilization is difficult. Defending it is even harder. Across Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and beyond, populations continued growing. Trade routes expanded. Cities became richer. Kings became more ambitious. For the first time in history, multiple great powers existed at the same time. They traded with one another, learned from one another, copied one another. But sooner or later, they would fight one another. And when they did, history would never be the same. Among the most powerful rulers of this new age was a man whose name still echoes across thousands of years: Ramesses II. History remembers him as Ramesses the Great. And few rulers have ever worked harder to ensure they would never be forgotten. Across Egypt, temples rose from the desert. Massive statues towered over cities. Monuments celebrated victories. Walls displayed scenes of power and glory. Wherever people traveled, they saw reminders of Ramesses. His message was clear: Egypt is strong. Egypt is eternal. And I am its ruler. But while Ramesses focused on his legacy, a powerful rival watched from the north: the Hittites, the same civilization whose rise marked the end of our previous chapter. Their empire stretched across much of Anatolia. Their armies were experienced, their rulers ambitious. Like Egypt, they controlled valuable trade routes. Like Egypt, they wanted influence. Like Egypt, they believed they deserved dominance. The problem was simple: there was only so much power to go around. Eventually, two great civilizations moving toward the same goal are bound to collide. And collide they did. The confrontation centered around a city known as Kadesh. Today it may seem like just another location on a map. But more than 3,000 years ago, Kadesh stood at one of the most important crossroads in the ancient world. Whoever controlled it could influence trade, movement, and power throughout the region. Neither Egypt nor the Hittites were willing to surrender that advantage. War became inevitable. Around 1274 BCE, Ramesses marched north with one of the largest armies Egypt had ever assembled. Thousands of soldiers, hundreds of chariots, veteran commanders, elite warriors. The pharaoh expected victory. After all, he was Ramesses the Great. But history often punishes overconfidence. As the Egyptian army approached Kadesh, Ramesses received intelligence claiming the Hittite forces were still far away. The information appeared reliable. The situation seemed under control. But there was a problem. The information was false. The Hittite army was much closer than anyone realized. In fact, it was already preparing to strike. Suddenly, thousands of Hittite chariots emerged from hiding. They crashed into Egyptian forces with terrifying speed. Confusion spread through the battlefield. Dust filled the air. Orders became difficult to hear. Units became separated. For a moment, one of the greatest rulers in Egyptian history stood dangerously close to disaster. Everything could have ended there. The reputation, the campaign, perhaps even the empire itself. But the battle was far from over. Because what happened next would become one of the most famous military stories of the ancient world. And depending on which side told the story, both armies somehow managed to claim victory. The Battle of Kadesh quickly descended into chaos. Egyptian forces fought desperately to regain control. Messengers raced across the battlefield. Commanders struggled to organize scattered units. For a brief moment, the fate of one of the world's greatest civilizations hung in the balance. According to Egyptian records, Ramesses personally led a counterattack. His inscriptions describe him charging into battle against overwhelming odds. Alone, outnumbered, refusing to retreat. Whether every detail is accurate remains uncertain. Ancient rulers were not exactly famous for modesty. But one thing is clear. Ramesses managed to stabilize the situation. The Egyptian army avoided disaster. The Hittites failed to achieve a decisive victory. And after hours of brutal fighting, neither side could completely defeat the other. The result was something unusual. A battle where both sides claimed success. Egyptian monuments celebrated victory. Hittite records suggested the opposite. Thousands of years later, historians still debate exactly who gained the advantage. But perhaps they are asking the wrong question. Because the most important outcome was not who won. It was what happened afterward. For generations, powerful kingdoms often responded to conflict with more conflict. War followed war. Victory invited revenge. Defeat inspired retaliation. The cycle continued endlessly. Yet Egypt and the Hittites eventually chose a different path. Diplomacy. Negotiations began. Representatives met. Agreements were discussed. Compromises were reached. And eventually, the two great powers signed what many historians consider the first known international peace treaty in human history. Think about how remarkable that is. More than 3,000 years ago, long before modern governments, long before international law, long before global organizations, ancient rulers had already discovered an important truth. Sometimes peace creates more prosperity than conquest. The treaty established mutual cooperation. Each side promised assistance if attacked. Both powers agreed to maintain stable relations. Trade expanded. Communication improved. And for a time, two rival civilizations found a way to coexist. It was one of humanity's earliest diplomatic successes. Unfortunately, history was preparing a much larger challenge. One that neither Egypt nor the Hittites could fully anticipate. Toward the end of the Bronze Age, strange events began unfolding across the ancient world. Cities were abandoned. Trade routes collapsed. Kingdoms disappeared. Entire civilizations began to weaken. At first, the changes seemed isolated. A disrupted trade route here. A struggling harvest there. Political instability in one region. Migration in another. But gradually a larger pattern emerged. Something was happening. Something enormous. The interconnected world that had taken centuries to build was beginning to unravel. Then came the mystery that continues to fascinate historians today. The Sea Peoples. Even now, nobody knows exactly who they were. We do not know where they originated. We do not know why they moved. We do not know whether they were a single group or many different groups. They seem to appear almost suddenly within historical records. And wherever they appeared, destruction often followed. Ancient cities burned. Trade networks fractured. Kingdoms struggled to survive. For the people living at the time, it must have felt like the world was falling apart. Imagine waking up in a civilization that had existed for generations. The trade routes your economy depends upon suddenly disappear. Neighboring kingdoms collapse. Refugees begin arriving from distant lands. Rumors spread of invasions and disasters. Nobody knows what is happening. Nobody knows how to stop it. Fear grows. Uncertainty spreads. The future becomes impossible to predict. This was the reality facing much of the ancient world. One of the greatest victims was the Hittite Empire. For centuries, the Hittites had stood among the dominant powers of the Near East. They controlled territory, influenced trade, commanded powerful armies. Then, almost unbelievably, they vanished. Their empire collapsed. Their political system disappeared. Their power evaporated. One of the greatest civilizations of the Bronze Age simply ceased to exist. And they were not alone. Across the eastern Mediterranean, similar disasters unfolded. Kingdoms weakened. Cities were abandoned. Trade routes broke apart. The highly connected Bronze Age world entered a period of crisis. Historians still debate the exact cause. Climate change may have played a role. Drought may have contributed. Economic instability may have weakened societies. Migration may have increased pressure. War may have accelerated the collapse. Most likely, several factors combined into a perfect storm. A reminder that civilizations are often more fragile than they appear. From a distance, great empires seem permanent. Their monuments inspire confidence. Their armies project strength. Their wealth appears endless. But history repeatedly teaches the same lesson. Strength can become weakness. Success can create vulnerability. And no civilization is immune to change. Yet even during collapse, humanity continued moving forward. Knowledge survived. Ideas survived. Stories survived. The world that emerged after the Bronze Age would look very different from the one that came before. Old powers faded. New powers prepared to rise. And far to the east, in the lands of ancient China, a revolutionary idea was beginning to take shape. An idea that would influence rulers for thousands of years. An idea known as the mandate of heaven. And it would completely transform how people understood power itself. As the Bronze Age world struggled through collapse and uncertainty, a different story was unfolding in the East. In the lands that would one day become China, rulers were beginning to ask a question that has challenged every civilization throughout history. Why do some leaders deserve power while others lose it? For many ancient societies, the answer seemed simple. Kings ruled because they were born into the right family. Their authority came from bloodlines, from ancestry, from tradition. But Chinese civilization gradually developed a different idea. One that would influence governments for thousands of years. The mandate of heaven. At first, the concept seems straightforward. A ruler governs because heaven allows it. But there was an important condition. Heaven's approval was not permanent. It had to be earned. And it could be lost. If a ruler governed wisely, maintained order, and cared for the people, heaven's favor remained. But if a ruler became corrupt, incompetent, or tyrannical, heaven could withdraw its support. When that happened, rebellion became justified. A new dynasty could rise. A new ruler could claim legitimacy. It was a revolutionary idea. Power was no longer guaranteed forever. Authority carried responsibility. Success mattered. Results mattered. Leadership mattered. The concept emerged during the rise of the Zhou dynasty. According to tradition, the Zhou overthrew the Shang dynasty and used the mandate of heaven to explain why the transfer of power was legitimate. The message was powerful. The Shang had lost heaven's favor. The Zhou had gained it. Whether people fully believed the explanation or not, the idea endured, and it became one of the foundations of Chinese political thought. For centuries, dynasties would rise and fall under its influence. Whenever disasters struck, whenever famine spread, whenever corruption increased, people often asked the same question: has heaven withdrawn its support? The answer could determine the fate of an empire. Yet while rulers debated legitimacy, Chinese civilization itself continued growing. Cities expanded, trade increased, agriculture improved, populations rose, and with prosperity came a new challenge. How should people live? What creates a good society? What makes a good leader? What responsibilities do individuals owe one another? These questions may sound familiar today. That is because humanity has never stopped asking them. And during this period, some of history's greatest thinkers began searching for answers. One of them would become among the most influential figures who ever lived. Confucius. Born in 551 BCE, Confucius did not begin life as a king. He did not command armies. He did not build empires. His weapon was an idea. Actually, many ideas. Confucius looked at the disorder around him and believed society functioned best when people understood their responsibilities. Children should respect parents. Parents should guide children. Leaders should serve as moral examples. Citizens should act with integrity. Harmony, he believed, emerged when people fulfilled their roles honorably. His teachings focused on ethics, character, education, self-improvement, the importance of learning. He believed that wisdom was not something people were born with. It was something they developed through effort, through discipline, through reflection. At first, Confucius gained only a small following. He traveled, taught students, shared his ideas. Sometimes he struggled to find powerful leaders willing to listen. Yet history often surprises us. Because ideas can travel farther than armies. Long after Confucius died, his teachings spread across China, then across East Asia. Generation after generation studied his words. Governments adopted many of his principles. Schools taught his philosophy. Millions of lives were shaped by concepts first discussed more than 2,000 years ago. Few individuals have ever influenced human civilization so deeply. Yet Confucius was not the only thinker trying to understand the world. Another philosopher looked at society and reached a very different conclusion. His name was Lao Tzu. And where Confucius saw structure, duty, and responsibility, Lao Tzu saw something else. Nature, balance, flow. He believed many human problems emerged because people constantly fought against the natural order of things. Trying to control everything, trying to force outcomes, trying to dominate situations beyond their control. According to tradition, Lao Tzu taught that wisdom often comes from moving with life's currents rather than against them. Water became one of his favorite symbols. Think about water. It appears soft, gentle, harmless. Yet over time, water can carve valleys through solid rock. It adapts, flows, finds a path. Lao Tzu believed human beings could learn from that example. His philosophy eventually became known as Taoism, a tradition emphasizing balance, harmony, simplicity, and alignment with the natural world. Where Confucius focused on social order, Lao Tzu focused on inner peace. Different answers to the same questions. Different paths toward understanding life. And together, their ideas helped shape Chinese civilization for thousands of years. Yet while philosophers debated the meaning of a good life in the East, another civilization was beginning to emerge in the West. A civilization that would transform politics, warfare, philosophy, and culture. A civilization built not around one kingdom, but around hundreds of competing city-states. Its people would produce legendary warriors, revolutionary thinkers, brilliant artists, and some of the most famous stories ever told. The ancient Greeks, and their rise was about to change the course of history. The rise of Greece did not begin with a king. It did not begin with an empire. And it did not begin with a single ruler trying to control millions of people. Instead, it began with hundreds of independent communities scattered across mountains, valleys, islands, and coastlines. Geography shaped everything. Unlike Egypt, which was united by the Nile. Unlike Mesopotamia, which grew around great rivers. Greece was divided by rugged terrain. Mountains separated communities. The sea connected them. As a result, the Greeks developed a very different kind of civilization. Instead of one kingdom, they created city-states, independent political communities that governed themselves. Each had its own laws, its own traditions, its own ambitions, its own identity. Some became wealthy through trade. Others became powerful through military strength. Some focused on art and philosophy. Others focused almost entirely on warfare. And among all these city-states, two would become the most famous: Athens and Sparta. But before either reached its peak, Greek influence was already spreading across the Mediterranean. As populations grew, many Greeks left their homeland in search of opportunity. New settlements appeared along distant coastlines. From modern Italy to the shores of the Black Sea, Greek merchants carried goods across vast distances. Greek sailors crossed dangerous waters. Greek culture began spreading far beyond Greece itself. Ideas traveled with them. Language traveled with them. Knowledge traveled with them. The Greek world was becoming larger every generation. Yet while some Greeks sought prosperity through trade, others focused on something very different: military excellence. No city-state embraced that path more completely than Sparta. Sparta was unlike almost every society around it. Its citizens believed strength was the foundation of survival. From an early age, Spartan boys entered a demanding system of training. Discipline became a way of life. Hardship became normal. Comfort was considered dangerous. Luxury was viewed with suspicion. The goal was simple: create warriors capable of defending the state. And over time, Sparta developed one of the most respected military reputations in the ancient world. Stories of Spartan discipline spread far beyond Greece. Enemies feared them. Allies respected them. Visitors often found their way of life shocking. Everything seemed focused on preparation. Preparation for conflict. Preparation for sacrifice. Preparation for war. Yet Sparta's greatest strength also became its greatest limitation. While they excelled on the battlefield, they invested far less energy in areas such as philosophy, science, literature, and artistic innovation. Other Greek city-states would eventually surpass them in those fields. Especially one city, Athens. If Sparta became famous for warriors, Athens became famous for ideas. The city grew into a center of trade, learning, and culture. Merchants arrived from distant regions. Artists displayed their work. Thinkers debated difficult questions. Citizens gathered to discuss politics. And within Athens, an experiment began that would influence history for thousands of years. Democracy. The idea was revolutionary. Rather than allowing a single ruler to make every decision, citizens could participate in governing the state. The system was imperfect. Women could not vote. Slaves could not vote. Many residents had no political rights. By modern standards, it was deeply limited. Yet the concept itself was extraordinary. Government could involve participation rather than absolute rule. Citizens could debate policies, vote on decisions, influence the direction of society. For the first time, political power was being distributed in a way few civilizations had previously attempted. The experiment would inspire countless governments in the centuries to come. But while Athens and Sparta were developing along very different paths, a new power was rising far beyond Greece. A power unlike anything the Greeks had ever faced. In the vast lands to the east, one remarkable leader was uniting territories on an unprecedented scale. His name was Cyrus, and history would remember him as Cyrus the Great. Unlike many conquerors, Cyrus understood that power is not maintained through fear alone. Armies can seize territory, but lasting empires require something more: trust, cooperation, stability. As Cyrus expanded his influence, he often allowed conquered peoples to keep their traditions, cultures, and religions. This approach helped him build loyalty across enormous distances. And those distances were extraordinary. His empire grew larger and larger. Cities joined his realm. Kingdoms submitted. Trade flourished. Roads connected distant regions. Before long, the Persian Empire became the largest empire the world had ever seen. Its scale was almost unimaginable. From the perspective of many Greeks, Persia seemed unstoppable. Rich, organized, powerful, a giant standing on the horizon. And that giant was getting closer. At first, many Greeks underestimated the danger. After all, their city-states had spent generations competing with one another. Athens distrusted Sparta. Sparta distrusted Athens. And many Greeks were more concerned with local rivalries than distant threats. But history was moving toward a collision. A collision between the world's greatest empire and a collection of fiercely independent city-states. The outcome would decide the future of Greece. And perhaps the future of Western civilization itself. Because in the next chapter of our story, the Persian Empire will come face to face with the Greeks. And the battle that follows will produce some of the most legendary moments in human history. Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, names that still echo across thousands of years. And this is where the story becomes truly unforgettable. The Persian Empire appeared unstoppable. Its territory stretched across continents. Its wealth was unmatched. Its armies seemed endless. To many observers, the outcome of any future conflict appeared obvious. How could a collection of small Greek city-states possibly resist the greatest empire on earth? The first answer came at a place called Marathon. In 490 BCE, Persian forces landed on Greek soil. Their goal was clear: punish Athens, demonstrate Persian power, remind the Greeks who truly dominated the region. The Athenians faced a terrifying reality. They were heavily outnumbered. Many expected defeat. Some may have expected annihilation. Yet the Greeks possessed one advantage. They were fighting for their homes, for their families, for their freedom. When the battle began, the Athenians did something few thought possible. They attacked, charging across the battlefield toward the Persian army. The clash was fierce. But when the fighting ended, the impossible had happened. The Persians retreated. Athens had survived. The victory shocked the ancient world. For the first time, The seemingly unstoppable Persian Empire had been defeated by a much smaller opponent. Yet everyone understood the truth. Persia would return. And next time, the challenge would be far greater. 10 years later, it did. A new Persian ruler, Xerxes, assembled one of the largest military forces the world had ever seen. Soldiers arrived from across the empire. Engineers built bridges. Supply lines stretched for incredible distances. The invasion was massive. Entire Greek cities watched with fear as news spread. The Persians were coming. Many believed resistance was hopeless. But among the Greeks stood a king whose name would become legendary. Leonidas of Sparta. Knowing they could not stop the Persian army forever, a small Greek force moved to a narrow mountain pass called Thermopylae. The location was critical. The narrow terrain prevented the Persians from fully using their enormous numbers. For several days, the Greeks held their ground. Wave after wave of Persian attacks failed. The defenders refused to break, refused to surrender, refused to retreat. Eventually, betrayal revealed a path around the Greek position. The Persians surrounded them. The battle was lost. Yet Leonidas and his warriors remained. They fought knowing they would not survive. They fought because their stand bought time for the rest of Greece. Thousands of years later, Thermopylae remains one of history's most famous examples of courage against impossible odds. But despite the heroism, the Persian advance continued. Athens was evacuated. The city was captured. Parts of it burned. For a moment, it appeared that Persia's victory was inevitable. Yet history was about to deliver another surprise. Because wars are not always decided on land. Sometimes they are decided at sea. Greek leaders lured the Persian fleet into the narrow waters near Salamis. There, the enormous Persian navy struggled to maneuver. Greek ships struck with precision. Confusion spread through the Persian ranks. Ship collided with ship. Formation collapsed. Control disappeared. What followed became one of the most decisive naval victories in ancient history. The Persian fleet suffered devastating losses. Suddenly, the balance of power shifted. The invasion that had once seemed unstoppable began to unravel. Eventually, the Persians withdrew. Greece had survived. And that survival changed history. Had the Persian Empire succeeded completely, the future of Western civilization might have looked very different. Instead, the Greek city-states entered a remarkable period of growth. A period historians often call the Golden Age of Greece. Athens flourished. Art advanced. Architecture reached new heights. Philosophers explored questions that still challenge us today. What is justice? What is truth? What is the purpose of life? Great thinkers emerged. Socrates, Plato, others whose ideas continue influencing the modern world. The Greeks proved that civilizations are remembered not only for their armies, but also for their ideas. Yet prosperity rarely lasts forever. As Athens grew stronger, tensions with Sparta increased. Old rivalries returned. Suspicion deepened. Competition intensified. The city-states that had once united against Persia slowly turned against one another. And from that conflict, Greece would gradually weaken. A new power would soon emerge from the north. A kingdom many Greeks initially underestimated. A kingdom called Macedon. And from Macedon would come a young man whose ambition would surpass nearly everyone who came before him. A man who would conquer much of the known world before reaching the age of 33. A man whose name would become immortal. Alexander. But that is a story for the next chapter. If you enjoyed this journey through the rise of the first great powers, make sure to subscribe and join us for the next episode. Because the story of humanity is only becoming more extraordinary. In the next chapter, we will witness the rise of Alexander the Great, the fall of mighty kingdoms, and the creation of an empire unlike anything the world had ever seen. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next chapter of civilization. Quote.